Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for the IT glitch. Something's happened where I can't see, my camera's not working, but I know that our special guest, Professor Juanita Sherwood, is online, and hopefully her camera's... Hey, I'm here. Oh, yes. Doesn't take much to get me excited. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Professor Yvette Rowe. I'm a Nyinganay Yarra woman from the West Kimberleys and happily reside on the, acknowledge the traditional lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people here in Meanjin, Brisbane. Thanks a lot for your patience this morning. Those little IT bugs, they're gremlins and they get into everything. First of all, again, acknowledging the lands that we're all on and the airways and the landscapes and the ancestors that keep us strong today. Want to acknowledge that. I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping and then I'm going to introduce our special guests here this afternoon. This is our the first seminar of our Birthing on Country CRE. And what we're planning to do is we have a host of amazing researchers, speakers, activists, disruptors who have got a wealth of information and experience to share with us. And the first one that took up the invitation was Professor Juanita Sherwood. But in the sense of logistics this afternoon, Professor Sherwood's going to present a inspiring, uplifting and amazing presentation. And then we've got 25 minutes of questions that will be posed to Professor Sherwood. And I'm going to ask you to post your questions in the message. And I'll then ask Professor Sherwood at the end of it. In the sense of protocol, can you please put your videos on mute? And so that doesn't interrupt the flow of it. And then if there's anything outstanding, I'll do the wrap up at the end. So as I sort of mentioned previously, this series of webinars comes from the Birthing on Country Centre for Research Excellence, which was awarded to an amazing multidisciplinary team, which includes Professor Sherwood. It was awarded to myself and from other chief investigators in August last year. And it's a Birthing on Country Centre of Research Excellence, which was awarded by the NHMRC, the National Health and Medical Research Council. And it's quite a sort of eminent award, because there's not many that get awarded, and this is Charles Darwin's first CRE, hopefully the first of many, because we think this stuff that we're doing is really important. The vision for the CRE is to redesign maternal, newborn and child health and support services in multiple locations to make a positive impact on Australia's First Nations people, including the reduction of preterm birth weight. That means babies who are born too small and too early, and also strengthen family capacity and reduce the removal of infants within that first 12 months. So some real key outcomes that we're striving for. The CRE is funded on some key things. One, it's about generating high-level evidence. It's about collaboration in a multidisciplinary team, collaboration within Australia and internationally. It also has a key focus on building research capacity, and we have a focus very much on Aboriginal and Torres Strait researchers, as well as our non-Indigenous colleagues, and also to communicate our findings. So we're really excited that we have the CRE, and I'm really excited to present to you this afternoon Professor Juanita Sherwood. On the flyer that we sent out, we did provide a whole series of how amazing Juanita is. And we have a whole range of titles, and we've got our official title of Pro Vice Chancellor Indigenous Engagement at Charles Sturt University. And I guess my interaction with Juanita is over 10 years, and you know, we can all Google her and sort of amazing things, and you can talk about how many books she's written and chapters and stuff like that. I guess from my personal experience, which makes me really excited, she's a lady of extreme and high-level scholarship, integrity, activism, capacity building, and is very staunch in where she sees our research making an impact and how we do research. So I'm going to hand it over to Professor Juanita Sherwood to actually introduce herself and hand the seminar over to her. Thank you, Juanita.
Thank you very much, Yvette. That was probably too good an introduction. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you about decolonising research. It is something I'm very passionate about, and I'm sure you will become passionate about it too. I'd like to just firstly acknowledge the lands that we're all on today, and thank you, Yvette, for your initial acknowledgement of country. I'm acknowledging the lands I'm on. I'm on Wiradjuri lands, and I am from the Wiradjuri Nation, so it's the first time I've been able to live and work on Wiradjuri country, which is fantastic for me. It took a while, but I got here. Sue's going to help me with the slides, and Sue Mack, I should say, and we'll get through this space. There's going to be questions later, as Yvette had suggested, and I'm a little bit nervous, so just bear with me. So decolonisation, we can go to the next slide, is what is decolonising research? Now, really importantly, the Decolonizing Methodologies is a fabulous book that you should all purchase by Linda Tuohy-Smith, who's a Maori academic and who, you know, absolutely has been such a very strong advocate for First Nations research, Kapaa Maori research as well. And she talks about decolonising, as you can see. I'm just going to, what decolonising methodologies is. And I'll let you read that. You don't need me to read it. But what it does mean, I think this is a really important thing. People get a bit worried when we start talking decolonising research because they think, oh, well, we're throwing research out the window. We're not throwing research out the window. What we're actually doing, and it means that we're not rejecting or totally rejecting all theory or all research or Western knowledge. Rather, it's about us centering our concerns, our worldviews, and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our perspective and our purposes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about worldview and pedagogy and paradigms. So worldviews we have, and we're standing from a First Nations worldview standpoint. They're paradigmatic, and which is to say they guide and determine our entire mode of living for cultural beings. Perspectives can be considered more personal and less objective or concrete than paradigms. What is important is that we have perspectives and paradigms incorporated into the ways of knowing and being and doing. And so when we talk about ethics and axiology, how do I act as a moral person? Epistemology, how do I know the world? And ontology, what are the authentic and fundamental elements of my world? And our methodology, what is the best way for me to learn about the world, is coming from a First Nations standpoint, which is very different to a Western standpoint. So when we talk about decolonising, we're saying, hey, we're trying to centre our worldview in this space. We're talking about our people, and we want you to know that because we're talking about our people, our ways of knowing and being and doing are critical to the way we do research. Thank you. And that often, I mean, we are challenging the research, the power of research. Do you want to go back to that one? We didn't yet. And what is really important is that we're trying to provide a story around why. I guess the most critical part of a decolonising agenda around research is what I find often is missing in most research is a context of why we are dealing with our current circumstances. Now, that could be history, it could be, well, it does include a history, it does include the standpoint that we're in, it does include the gaze. And I'm going to talk about the gaze now, which we've had a problem with, which has problematised us. So since Mick Dodson says this very well. He goes, since their first intrusive gaze, colonising cultures have had a preoccupation observing, analysing, studying, classifying and labelling Aborigines and Aboriginality. Under that gaze, Aboriginality changed from being a daily practice to being a problem to be solved. And I'm certain that most of you in your training and education learned about Aboriginality or Aboriginal peoples or First Nations peoples as problematic, and that, you know, the things that we deal with are problems. And so the nurturing of that, well, connecting us with problem is the way we've been dealt with for the last 230 years. So for some 150 years, research has focused on knowing us, only on just knowing us. And we were put in the space of, you know, that we were prehistoric, primitive man. We were really important dead rather than alive for museums, and there were shootings and killing fields that utilised our bodies, and they were transferred all around the world. So we became very important prizes for the museums. And when we weren't doing that, we were considered to be disease carrying and problematic, and that was a notion that many Australians were informed and educated about thinking about us. So research had problematised us, and I think it's a really important point to appreciate where we're standing with research. Linda Smith always says that, you know, for many Aboriginal people across the world, the term research is the dirtiest word in the world for us, because it has created us in a vision that is not the way we see ourselves. And that is probably the most important point about why we need to decolonise the research, because we need to see ourselves in the research. We need to see our hearts and our voices and our communities represented in the stories that we are going to tell about us. We don't want somebody telling our story on behalf of us. That is not what we want at all. And in fact, the last 50 years of research has basically done that, and it's been problematic, and it hasn't been a good outcome. So some of the reasons why is that science and medicine, in their support of the country's colonial agenda, so previously anthropologists and medical doctors and got together and did objectify and displayed us as problematic, and we were destined for dying out. They were going to soothe the dying pillow, but we didn't. We were stronger than they thought. But the ill-informed assumptions survived. We did too, but so did the assumptions that remained intact through writings of health experts and have influenced health research and its translation, policy development. And I just think, just for an example, we had Close the Gap. The policy just changed last year, and we were included in being involved in the involvement. 2020, we finally get the government's okay to say we can have a role in closing the gap discussions about us. So we're still dealing with some of these issues. Funding, service provision and attitudes of health professionals. The colonial agenda had a method for which Edward Said has called Orientalism, and its method that has been used by the academy and governments and science to promote their superiority of Western ways of knowing, being and doing over those they usurped. Now, this method created the expert, and whose view of the native was considered a truth and became the legitimate way of knowing and writing about us. Now, that's really important. So for many, many years, and in your public health agenda, you have taught that, you know, Aboriginal people have this problem. We've got the worst health in the country. These are all issues that are used to suggest that, you know, yes, we do have a lot of health issues. But what caused it? How did they come about? We didn't actually go looking for them and say, hey, bring them on, because we're actually the healthiest people in the world 250 years ago, compared to the people that came to our shores. They were amazed at our stealth and our amazing diet. So the shift in our ability to look and be healthy was caused by something. So anyway, the approach that's led to ill-informed research practice, colonial amnesia, and poor Aboriginal health status. And that has been our problem. We've got people who forgot about our history, the 200 years of not treating us too well, and the resulting health status. And again, the research that keeps on, and I found, you know, through my thesis that we reading doctors' writings keeps reinforcing reading doctors' writings. And so you read something and you go, oh, okay, I'll quote that. And that I saw 40 years of writing being rewritten into a story about us, without us. And that has been a big issue around what we need to get rid of, that homogeny, and unpack the colonial history that is part of that space. So the key players that have promoted that we are problematic were the colonial and scientific experts who wrote about and defined us as the other. Later on, we became the Aboriginal other, but othering became a Western truth, a way of knowing us. It indoctrinated a one-way colonial agenda that had to establish Indigenous peoples' life worlds as inferior and deviant. And that was because, you know, there was a big problem. They came here, they said that it was a land of no people, and then there were. And then, well, they had to prove that they were more civilised, because that was part of how they could actually occupy a country, ideally, if we were so inferior and deviant that we weren't people. And guess what? That's how they treated us. So that has had a major impact in the way we continue to be described in many ways. And I think, I guess I'll leave it at that. These truths developed in the field of Aboriginalism informed generations of non-Indigenous Australians about Aboriginal Australians and the ways to treat us when they met us. Now, problematically, people still think and work this way. Schools use these expert sources to teach about the primitive First Peoples of Australia, and I'm sure people my age will remember that that's exactly what they got taught at school. Media leapt at any opportunity to support the experts' ideologies of the savage Aboriginal. And this is how non-Indigenous Australians, without any meaningful contact with us, got to know all there was to know about the primitive other. And generally, in education, we had a half a page on Aboriginal people, and they were in their primitive dress, and on a page in your social studies book, and never talked about again until I got to university. Health professionals and researchers also learned this way and would have received limited exposure to an appreciation of the diversity, complexity, and richness of our cultures. We are a heterogeneous group of people. We have different cultures, we have different languages, we have different ways of knowing and being and doing. We can't be, what you do in Alice Springs with our peoples is very different to what you do, how you work with us in Bathurst and out on Wiradjuri lands. The lack of knowledge and limited exposure is problematic for us on so many levels. Firstly, because it speaks volumes about the lack of a balanced Australian historical education provided in Australian primary, secondary, and I'm going to say tertiary. I had a student complaint last week about a lecturer who's taught their students about the primitive Aborigines and how they were a classless society. And because of their inferiorness, they did not have hierarchies, which was part of being actually a very evolved way of thinking. But the fact that he used the language that he used is highly problematic. And that's in a university here, the one I work in, CSU 2021. And unfortunately, we know that people are still talking and teaching in this way. Now, secondly, what happens? It positions health professionals in a state of unease and unknowing, which will inevitably have an impact on their levels of confidence and competence when working with us, wherever it may be, in a rural, remote or urban area. And thirdly, this unease is transferred onto us. Oh my goodness, how many of us have been in hospital settings and told, oh, you really don't look Aboriginal. Oh, you can't really have a problem. And right away, whether you do look Aboriginal or you don't, the nurse or the doctor will have to, spend 10 minutes telling you what they think about you as Aboriginal people. I've had so many horrific experiences being a patient in a health setting when I've had to admit that that's my who I am. This is a story that many people deal with day in and day out, and it's not okay, and it does undermine the level of safety you feel in a health setting. And thirdly, and finally, these experiences of dis-ease open a floodgate of misleading information for both us and then the health professionals to accept each other's truths. And I guess, I've been working on coroners' cases where nursing and medical staff have decided that, they already know that an Aboriginal patient who's coming in with pain is definitely a drug addict. And if they're a drug addict, then you don't do anything for them. You don't bother taking their observations. You give them some Panadol and an ice block and you send them on their way. Well, after you're doing that for 18 months and then the person actually dies from, the issues, the septicemia that has been brewing for a while with that pain, if they had taken observations, they may have noticed that, these ways of thinking still inform health practice today. And we've got to be very aware of that. And that again is why we've got to decolonise the way we not only how we do the research, but how we write about the research and how and whose power do we use around telling that story. So I feel we still don't know enough and we still don't have access enough to knowledge about us. And this is why this research project is so important, because it is about building knowledge from a standpoint that is not biased, that it accepts and knows that this is, we are working towards developing the truths of women in this project. So it's not going to be some doctor's story. It's not going to be someone who's been working for 50 years in this area because they know these women. And I got told that about 3 weeks ago in a research meeting. I don't need to talk to community. I've been working with them for a long time and I can tell you their stories. We don't want that either. We want the people we talk to tell their stories. And our job is to facilitate that to happen in the safest way possible. So what is not appreciated, I guess, by the health system is that the naming and blaming in research often injures people. It injures the First Nations researchers and the constructs that are developed that the improper constructs, unfortunately, people internalise. And they are fully aware of the lack of respect they receive when they are within a system. And, you know, and I should be able to just go, look, don't talk to me like that. But when you are, you know, you have an authority, you're in a white gown, freezing on a bed, and someone comes in and, you know, exerts their power, you don't feel confident to speak back. Even if, you know, I'm a professor, I still don't feel confident to go, well, excuse me, you know, you're being racist. So it is important that we appreciate and value that we are still dealing with many things that aren't told or aren't dealt with. So I just wanted to jump in and tell you that we know how to change things. We know how to make things a bit different. And I think in the last three, First Nation researchers in Australia over the last 3 decades have really greatly informed and improved the work of our communities, their organisations and our First Nation researchers. And we've done that in partnership with national bodies such as the National Health and Medical Research Council, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, LOICHA, the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council, NACCHO, many bodies. And those bodies have listened to us and they've worked with us to hear our concerns and regarding ethical research practices, etc. These bodies have assisted us to develop and deliver our research protocols and roadmaps for working safely for and with our communities. They've also supported the First Nations workforce of health providers, academics and researchers to participate in setting the research agendas for our communities and enabling our projects to be funded. This progress has not been easy, and I'm sure Yvette's got some scars, I've got several, most of us have. It's not been an easy time. We really had to fight to be heard in this space. And it's required great stamina from our communities, their organisations and our First Nation academic bodies to speak their truths regarding their research experience and journey. Importantly, over the last 2 decades, we've produced research outcomes locally, nationally and internationally that have made a significant difference. We, First Nation researchers, have developed guidelines and protocols for ethical Indigenous health research, and we've provided expertise to the development of 3 NHMRC roadmaps, which are instrumental pieces of ethical guidelines to researching in our communities and demonstrate the seriousness of our endeavours to improve the health outcomes of our communities and peoples. With integrity and perseverance, we First Nations researchers have put the Indigenous health research on the map of universities who target Indigenous health dollars to build their notability, continuously ensuring our legacy of hard work and painful encounters has well been worth it. Many First Nation health researchers have had to lead campaigns to enable our development within the academy. And we worked hard to be taken seriously and to extricate ethics protocols to ensure no further harm was done to our communities. By researchers who experimented on us, tested drug therapies on us, and generally promoted us in their deficit discourses to further expand their notoriety. These stories have often not been shared because they are shameful. These stories are not new, nor are they old, and a critical part of our journey's strengths and challenges to ensure that we continuously make a difference for our people. So that's why we are promoting a decolonising research agenda. And ready for the next slide. Now, it is a vital pedagogy, it's a paradigm, it's a methodology, it's a strategy to assist in unpacking, I think, unpacking all the things that colonisation contribute to. I mean, colonisation hasn't stopped. We are still dealing with colonisation, and I think, don't talk post-colonisation, we are still in a colonial state. And how can we not be when, you know, juvenile justice centres are filled with our children? Only just recently, with Closing the Gap last week, were we able to shift the age of incarceration of children from 10 to 14. So 10-year-olds were going to prison. And when I lived in the Northern Territory, children were going to prison for stealing, you know, a 5-packet of colouring in pencils, a packet of biscuits, ending up in a prison because that was the 3rd time that they had actually stolen a packet of pencils or a packet of biscuits. And unfortunately, these people ended up dying in prison when they took their own lives. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So I guess I feel that decolonisation is something that we personally do. And we don't start thinking about decolonisation until we recognise that we are colonised. And I've talked to you about what colonisation looks like. It's where, you know, there's this concept of Western superiority, and it's not questioned. It's where there is this belief that, you know, we are the missing link. It's where we are considered the Australians' problem. Flip it. How do we, you know, we see, you know, white Australia as our problem. Look at what, I guess, just from my perspective, and my son shared this with me today. You know, the waters here in Bathurst are really high. We've got a big flood happening with the river, and I just sent him a photograph of it, and he said, oh, and I went, oh, you know, mother's angry. You know, the last 18 months we've had fires, floods, COVID, which I think's got to do with environmental impact, and now more flooding, and you know, our mother, the Mother Earth, is not happy with the way we're treating her. And really importantly, our ways of knowing and being and doing managed and looked after her so well. And I think we've got to start thinking about doing that. So we need to unpack the damage we've done to people through colonisation, and we need to unpack the damage we've done to the country through colonisation. And at the moment, we've got a plague of mice running through Western New South Wales. My team work in Dubbo, and they've had to sit on their desks because mice are biting their feet in their office. 3 people in Western New South Wales have been bitten by mice and have got some infection from that space. This is crazy, you know, this is crazy time. So we've got to look after country as well as we look after people. Next slide. So why is decolonising research important? By using our ways of knowing and being and doing, we become the brokers of solutions, and that's the way it has to be. We know how to look after ourselves. We've known for a long time. It's not something, and I guess what's really important is we've always known, but so many things have been put in the way to prevent that happening. And decolonising the way we have been promoted is one of the most critical spaces we have to take. Unlearn all the nasty things you've learned about us and start filling the gaps with knowledge from us, and good knowledge. Next slide. And as I said, colonisation has never stopped. And you know, we face it every day. And it is about, you know, dealing with the systems. I work in a university that the system is so rich with systemic colonial structures that are just totally unflexible. They do not want to flex to be able to promote an Indigenous or First Nations agenda. No, this is the way we've always done it, and we'll go, well, we've done it a bit longer than you guys, and you know, that's not how we do it. Let's make it work. So health systems are just the same. and they perpetuate violence by not being open, by not being sensitive, by not being flexible. Next slide. And as the over-incarceration of our people, as I've said, and particularly our youth, is just appalling. And unfortunately, it doesn't look good. The governments have done all they can to try and prevent any funding and reduction of funding to Indigenous legal services. All the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody had, 331 recommendations, and one recommendation out of those 331 have been taken up. The reasons why many of the recommendations haven't been able to be taken up is that the government has defunded all the programs that would have supported people from not going into spaces. I work currently as on the board of an organisation called Nellie's Place, which is a women's space for women coming out of prison, First Nation women coming out of prison. They have no support. They are not cared for. They're in there, they've done their time, they come out, they've got a family, they've got to find a house again, they've got to bring their kids back together. If the kids haven't been put into care, there's a whole lot of really critical things that need to be looked at and appreciated from, the continuing dispossession of Aboriginal people around what they can have and what they can't have and their families. Next slide. So First Nation research is fundamental to decolonisation, and that's what it's about. It's about having our pedagogy, it's about having Indigenous processes enabling and understanding our realities, and that's probably the most important point from the research perspective. Is everyone has their own standpoint, everyone has their own truths, but what's really critical is that many people may miss the nuance of our story because that hasn't been their experience. And research in our hands, we have had that experience. We do know those things. And taking you on a decolonising journey helps you value and appreciate where we've been. Next. So, yeah, it's about stopping the colonial violence in Western research, but it's also about stopping the colonial violence in the way services are provided. I got told by Waminda, a community organisation I work with, that as soon as you have a First Nation baby in the birthing unit down Shoalhaven Hospital, the first thing they come to you with a document, and it's your risk agenda, and straight away, if you're a First Nations person, you're high risk, and that's the tick, and you're ticked off, and people are terrified that this is the space and place that your child can be removed from you for swearing during your birthing process, and etc. We are concerned, and we do see day in and day out the impact of the Western colonial system continuing to treat us as a problem that they want to solve their way. That won't work for us. Next slide. So, really beautiful statement Janine Mohammed made last week in the Closing the Gap, that in our research we don't travel to the time frames often that we're expected to follow. We travel at the speed of trust from our communities. Our whole agenda of engagement is around building relationships so that we can have trust, so that people feel that they can comfortably tell us their stories. Next slide. So how does this approach reframe our understanding of health and wellbeing? Good question. Next. Colonisation is a primary determinant, and as is racism. And mainstream health continues to be a site where people are treated not well because of, as I've talked before, about the reproduction of the images that are produced about us as problematic. And anything different in our health space is seen as deficit. And so we continue to be featured into that deficit framework. And that is colonisation. And as this says, you know, the deficit discourse obscures colonisation and our health outcomes. And decolonisation is critical to improving health outcomes. Again, at Wemenda, we are decolonising the way we deal with organisations. And we actually say to the organisations, such as FACS, who remove our children, you know, they have a template that they have to complete when they are engaging with their client, the mother or the child. And there is no room in any of the documentation for them to tell a good news story. Everything in that template is focused around deficit, bad news stories, and the problematic nature. We've got to flip that and look at strengths-based models and strengths-based approaches have got to be part of our language when we talk about research in our communities. Here, just last week again, we are the only nation in the world that did not lose a First Nations person due to COVID because of our organisations. So we do know how to do this business. It's really important that this is recognised. And when we say, you know, hey, we know how to do this, listen to us. Next slide. So we may not be what you think as experts, but we've definitely got to be listened to when it comes to doing research for our people. And basically, I think that's it. So maybe we can talk about how we do decolonise research on this grant. Thank you, Sue, for going through these slides so well.
Thank you, Professor Juanita Sherwood. I will ask people to write questions in the comment section, but I just want to reiterate some powerful words that you said throughout your presentation. The description of colonial amnesia. You said, well, people think it's something historical, yet you were able to provide a pretty recent example of it in what we call this, you know, the academy, the institution, things like that. So how do we keep people accountable when we have those moments of, oh, okay, they think this is yes, you know, we need to move on and forget about these practices? What do we do in that kind of environment?
Well, I just think we claim them as determinants of health. I think, you know, look, sorry, it may be okay for you to feel that you don't need to talk about it, but actually, I did write something the other day. It was like everyone has the right to dignity. Just because you don't know my story, my community story, or my history does not give you the right to dismiss it. Your lack of knowing or ignorance is your problem. Don't make it mine.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think we need to be calling it quite strongly. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions come in as I go through that, but I will be coming back to some of those powerful words. We've got a question, which is an interesting one, which moves away from research from Netta. To make policy changes, do we really need more First Nations women in government?
Yep,
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
What do they bring to the table that's absent presently?
Well, they need, if they're done in Parliament, they need a big stick so they can smack a few of those men around, firstly. And what can we bring? I think we bring a collaborative community agenda. we've got knowledge, patience. The women, I mean, Yvette, you've worked in community control with a voice to government. Janine, I mean, we've got some amazing First Nations women out there who've been informed and are participating in that space. I just think we've got a lot to learn from you all and what you've done in this space. It's not an easy space, but it's a growing space. And I think as we have grown within the academy, we are starting to have some authority. It's taken a long time, but we need to value that authority. Now, as I said, it's a bit bloody hard to do that when you're on a hospital bed in a little white gown, to have that authority. You know, you've got to choose your place where you're going to use it.
Mm-hmm. We've got another question here, which is a really practical one. And for those, again, Juanita is very humble about the qualifications that she comes to the table. She was not only a nurse, but she was also a teacher and has been working in the sector for a long time. And I think in 2019, we had the national standards for hospitals about accreditation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. So I'm just going to bring that sort of in as it comes to Tracy's questions. How would you hold health providers accountable when they are in the process of accreditation?
Well, using the Commonwealth
the national standards?
Yes, the national standards for one. I think another very important one is the matrix from Queensland on racism in the health setting. And that's Henrietta Mara and her husband Adrian have developed this matrix, which is fantastic, and it actually is a tool to use to look at, which I think are critical points, and I'll just call them. Health facilities get a score based on 5 measures, and they are inclusion of Indigenous people in governance, so senior Aboriginal staff on the senior team. You can't have us working on the ground and not be involved in the management space. We've got to be there. Implementation of relevant policies. Our policies have to be informing this space. Rates of Indigenous employment. Let's forget parity. Let's forget the parity numbers. We want bigger numbers. I want 10% of Aboriginal people employed in a health setting, not 0.2% or not 2.4%. That just feeds into the ongoing marginalisation of us. We need to be stronger and say, no, forget it. You know, I want, you know, we're working in an environment where there are a lot of First Nations people here. Let's make 10% of our health staff First Nations. And that's going to shift the culture of that organisation dramatically. And that's what we need. Next, service delivery and financial accountability for Indigenous funding. We now need, organisations get funded for Indigenous things. We need to be steering that boat. We need to be told, what are you spending our money on? How are you spending it? Keep us involved in that process. So there's 2 important things, and cultural safety. We have to be rolling out cultural safety. Health settings have got to be the place, because people have got to, you know, if they want to be registered through APRA, they've got to be doing cultural safety training. So there's 3 big ways.
Okay. And Ned is going to chase up with you regarding that reference so we can post it on the website as well, which would be great if we could share that. I think what you've also brought is that, you know, again, colonisation is unpacking those assumptions. Why parity? Why 5%? Where do these numbers come from? And what's the point? I mean, NHMRC's, you know, 8 years were going on, you know, 2% of their funding was to be allocated to First Nation research. They now fund up to 6%. The question is, that's great. Why aren't we going to, you know, the level of burden of illness, if that's the case? So I think as researchers, one of the things is unpacking those assumptions that we take for granted. I think is really important, whether it's numbers or what we interpret as our knowledge systems. I have another question here. You've described the community participatory action research design that decolonises, that can contribute to decolonisation research. Can you tease that out a little bit more for us?
Well, collaborative participatory action research means, I think that's a very First Nations agenda. It's about, sitting down with people and, everyone participating on the same level. And that's, in a colonial research project, you've got your CIs who may not talk to the AIs, and the AIs might do the, consent form paper. There's a process and there's a hierarchy, and I think with CCPR you get rid of that hierarchy and you're being inclusive and everyone's gaining in, there's no expert in CCPR. The experts are all people participating, so there's not one expert, it's everyone that's involved. It's inclusive, and it's about ensuring that people have a voice. And I was thinking the other day about, we do a lot of work around storytelling as a really important methodology. And I have been going, but there's people are going, oh, I have a problem with that. And I'm going, well, the problem is that you want to code it like you would a normal. And I said, you got to listen to it. Storytelling is not to be coded, it's to be listened to, it's to be heard, and we know how to listen and we know how to hear. And so I guess it's about applying and learning about our methodologies and how you utilise them, and not try and shove our stuff into your Western knowledge box, because it's not going to work.
Probably just sort of as the last comment, I've got a sort of a question just would like you to expand on. As researchers, or often as clinicians, we think that we are really doing the best we can. And you really held us to account when you said some of our practice can perpetuate violence. And people are thinking, oh, that's not me, I'm a nice person. Can you just tease that out? How do we stop this colonial violence of research in our practice, but also recognising it? Okay.
Well, I guess the best thing is to definitely connect with community before you even go anywhere near a community to do research. And I am amazed that people still to this day sit around the table and go, oh, what are we going to do a research project on? Oh, I think we'll do a nice little one down the road for down the road and talk to an Aboriginal community and do, yeah, we've got some money at the moment, so why don't we do that? And no one sat down and asked the community, what do you actually want researched? What do you need to be researched? No, we don't want to do that. We're quite interested in this. So I think that really critically, the first thing you do is go and talk to the community. Don't do the research yet. And then include some First Nations people in your research team so that you get to learn about what's going on in that community. You may be very naive about what has been the story there, and that's where a lot of injury happens as well. I guess that, and it is, and just being a patient in a setting where you don't hold the power, you are in a powerless position, and someone comes in and growls you over, things that they think they've got an idea about because their auntie had told them this bad news story about an Aboriginal, that, it's time to talk to that Aboriginal person, because obviously they've shared that same experience. So yeah, just, be sensitive. And we are hyper vigilant to racism. We smell it a mile away. And even though it may not be your intention, we still sense it.
Professor Sherwood, I'm going to start to sort of wrap it up there. There's a series of questions that have come through. I'm going to email them to you, and I will send that back to the people who have sent the queries. In the sense of where to next, we're going to ensure that we're going to tighten up the recording and post it on the Molly Wardaguga Research site. So for those who have missed it, you'll be able to access it there with also some key snippets from the presentation. I know I just also want to finish with Sue Kilday's comment. Thank you so much. You're right. We need a lifelong learning approach to decolonising our research, our institutions, our parliament, led by Indigenous voices and Indigenous leaders in all governance structures. So I think, one of the things is it just about doing things in Indigenous ways? I think one of the critical take-home messages that people should take is that this is it's a personal journey, it's a truth-telling journey, and it's a critical analysis. Yeah. And then when you've had that conversation, how does it inform your actions? From the team at the Molly Wardaguga Research Centre, we really value your time and your expertise that you've contributed this afternoon. Again, to the participants, if you've got any follow-up questions, by all means, send them through to Netta, and I'll forward them on to Professor Sherwood. But thanks again. Thank you so much for preparing such an informative and engaging talk this afternoon. So thank you so much.
I'm clapping for everybody, Juanita.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a good afternoon. Ta-da.
Okay, bye. Bye.
Thanks, everybody, for coming along.
Yeah.